I'm Jeanette Roche, and this is Alberta Weekly. More than 700 protesters showed up at the University of Lethbridge to denounce a speaker who says wokeism is threatening academic freedom. Former Mount Royal University professor Frances Widdowson arrived at the U of L Wednesday for a speaking engagement despite the opposition. On Monday, the university canceled her lecture, but she insisted on still showing up, and when she arrived, she was greeted by over 700 students and staff who were not happy to see her. Video journalist Micah Quinn has the story.
Yo, Francis, get the out of here!
In the past, Frances Widdowson has brought forward controversial opinions on the Black Lives Matter movement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's decision that Canada's residential school system was genocidal, along with the educational benefits of residential schools. The Alberta Minister of Advanced Education, Dimitrios Nicolaides, says the UCP is planning to make an announcement to strengthen free speech at universities. Widdowson says she strongly believes in the right to free speech at post-secondaries.
Things are completely disintegrating before our eyes, and I really value our public institutions, and it's very, very disturbing to me that they are being destroyed in this way, and the government is responsible for the public funding of these institutions. My view is that we need a public inquiry about universities and open inquiry in Alberta.
On Wednesday evening, Dr. Mike Mann, the president and vice chancellor of the University of Lethbridge, sent Bridge City News a statement, which reads in part, "Tonight's events were a coming together of our community to show support for each other and a reflection of the values of the University of Lethbridge. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to our community members for conducting themselves in such a peaceful and powerful manner." Protesters of Widdowson said they were in full support of the U of L canceling her planned speaking engagement.
You know, it's the risk of misinformation for people who have not gathered previous information. You know, like residential school was not positive. I worked at a job last summer where I in-depth researched the 6 residential schools on the Blood Reserve. So I know every single incident, I know every single death that happened.
Widdowson told us she was escorted to a safe area in the U of L by security and then proceeded to leave the building. Later in the evening, she held her original planned lecture through Zoom. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
And as Micah mentioned in that story, Dimitrios Nicolaides, Minister of Advanced Education, issued a statement after the University of Lethbridge canceled the talk this week by the former Calgary professor who criticized the Black Lives Matter movement and claims that there were education benefits to residential schools. Nicolaides says that it's important for Alberta post-secondaries to foster a strong culture of free speech and diverse viewpoints. Now, as of Friday morning, Minister Nicolaides announced that post-secondary institutions must provide annual free speech reporting to the Minister of Advanced Education. Minister Nicolaides says that more needs to be done to ensure our institutions are adequately protecting free speech. Calgary Conservative MP Michelle Rempel-Garner says the Trudeau Liberals spent nearly $6.8 million on lodging expenses for 15 people who were put up at a Calgary quarantine hotel in 2022. At the beginning of the pandemic, the federal government set up quarantine hotels in 4 Canadian cities. In 2020, the Westin Calgary housed 119 travelers and spent $8.9 million. In 2021, more than $11 million was spent on less than 1,400 people. And in 2022, it spent $6.79 million on just 15 travelers. That works out to about $452,000 taxpayer dollars per person in 2022. Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilly explains how this may have happened.
Because the Trudeau Liberals kept this policy in place far longer than it needed to be. Whether you agreed with the policy or not, they kept it in far longer than other countries did who had similar policies. And so you end up with just 15 people staying there in fiscal year 2022-2023. So they could have canceled it. They could have shut it down ages ago. The contract agreement, as Michelle Rempel-Garner found out in the response to her order paper question, it could have been shut down with 30 days notice.
Concerns are growing across rural Alberta about the implications of the province's renewable energy boom. Alberta is now home to more than 3,800 megawatts of wind and solar capacity. 1,350 of which came online last year. While some are enjoying the extra income, others are sounding the alarm. The rural municipalities of Alberta recently called on the province to protect taxpayers from incurring costs associated with the potential decommissioning of renewable energy infrastructure. After the break, the trial ends for a pastor turned politician charged with mischief at the border. Keep it right here. Final arguments wrapped up Friday in the trial of a Calgary pastor turned politician accused of encouraging truckers to keep blocking the Canada-U.S. border crossing at Coutts, Alberta, to protest COVID-19 restrictions. Arthur Pawlowski was on trial in Lethbridge on charges of breaching a release order and mischief over his actions at the Coutts border crossing last winter. The Crown's case against Pawlowski consists of an agreed statement of facts and a 20-minute video of a speech he gave to protesters urging them to hold their ground because the eyes of the world were upon them. Pawlowski's lawyer says her client was only expressing an opinion and wasn't telling any of the protesters to do anything illegal. Pawlowski says he told the protesters at the border to remain peaceful.
The only thing that the Crown has presented was my sermon to the truckers and the farmers in Coutts exactly 1 year ago. What did I say during the speech? Well, I said to the people to stand for their grounds. I told them to do it peacefully, no guns, no swords. Well, the Crown prosecutor is comparing my speech to Rwanda genocide. I mean, that was a shocker. Well, I'm hoping to be vindicated 100%. I mean, I've done nothing wrong. If this is a trial of the century, if I'm convicted by giving people a sermon from our heart, reminding them of our history of the solidarity movement, if that's criminal behavior, there goes your freedom of expression, there goes your freedom of religion, there goes all your freedoms.
Pawlowski was charged with inciting mischief, counseling interference with critical infrastructure, and failing to keep the peace. Pawlowski's brother, David, was also at the courthouse and explained why he believes his brother is innocent.
What did my brother do at the border? He was called there to officiate a church service. So now you want to tell me that in Canada you cannot officiate a church service as a clergy man? What else did he do? He inspired the people to stand for their families, for their jobs, for their God-given freedoms. And on top of that, they had a Holy Communion. So what, Holy Communion now, if you do it as a clergyman or just a citizen, you're faced with a 10.5-year prison term. It's absolutely insanity.
And speaking of the Coutts border blockade, last weekend saw the 1-year anniversary of it. And to commemorate the occasion, a convoy was planned from Lethbridge to Coutts. BCN's Naveen Day caught up with the convoy and has the details.
It's been a year since the sound of honking horns made its way to the Coutts border in protest of public health mandates. And now, a convoy has done it again. This time, it's not just to observe the 1-year anniversary of the convoy to Coutts. It's in order to raise funds for 4 men charged with conspiracy to commit murder, a weapons offense, and mischief over $5,000. Chell Landry is the organizer of the convoy and event, which includes a barbecue and silent auction. I had a chance to catch up with her when the convoy rolled into Lethbridge shortly after they did a slow roll past the Lethbridge Correctional Centre. She says it's important for Canadians to remember that the restrictions imposed by the Trudeau Liberals have yet to be lifted.
They haven't been lifted, and people are going on as if they are because they don't know the difference and they don't understand what's really happening. People are just happy like, oh, well, I can go to Costco now, you know. So it's really important to create awareness and show people what's really happening and make them aware of our laws and the rights that we have, because they are being infringed upon, not just for us, not just for these 4 men, but for all Canadians. And it's really sad they don't know that, because if they did, we'd have a lot more support and the government wouldn't be able to bully us.
The 4 men charged are Anthony Olenek, Jerry Morin, Chris Carbert, and Chris Lysak. Landry says she feels the men are being held without bail because they are political prisoners.
They're being held to create an example of what can happen if you stand up and speak out against Justin Trudeau or the mandates or what he's trying to push on Canadians, which is a direct violation of our Bill of Rights, our Canadian Bill of Rights and our Alberta Bill of Rights.
According to Landry's team, 235 vehicles were counted as participating in the convoy. The event was peaceful and no one showed up to protest the event. As for the 4 accused, they are set to go to trial in June. The 3 men accused of organizing the blockade and protests at Coutts last year and who are charged with mischief over $5,000 are Marco Van Hugenbos, Alex Van Herk, and George Jansen. They will have a trial by jury commencing April 2nd, 2024. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
We'll be back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Alberta's Deputy Premier Nathan Neudorf is speaking out against Justin Trudeau's Just Transition plan. Neudorf says we shouldn't be so quick to transition away from our country's oil and gas sector and that the Trudeau Liberals need to stay in their lane. Neudorf connected with our own Hal Roberts to discuss the latest on how the province is addressing the physician shortage in our region. Here's part of that interview.
Nathan, Premier Daniel Smith has been outspoken about the Trudeau Liberals' Just Transition plan, transitioning hundreds of thousands of Albertans out of the oil and gas sector. How do you plan on fighting back on that? Perhaps maybe bringing forth the Alberta Sovereignty within the United Canada Act?
Well, what we prefer to start with is a collaborative approach. This just transition is completely out of touch with today's current realities. We have hundreds of thousands of employees serving in our oil and gas and our energy sector, and we have huge global demand for these products. Alberta leads the world on our ESG, our environmental and social governance policies. We're happy to lead the world in that. We are leading the way in Canada, and we need to make sure that we transition in the appropriate time when there's viable solutions. Many of them are not there. And people that come back and say, well, we have battery operated cars, all I say is, where does the energy come from to power those cars? Right now in Canada, the vast dominant supplier of that energy is oil or natural gas.
Let me ask you something. Is the province looking into potentially getting more of our oil and gas to Tidewater, perhaps through northern British Columbia? Have there been discussions with BC's new Premier, David Eby, in that regard?
Absolutely. We're looking at every option possible to getting our great energy to market, whether we go through BC in cooperation with the new premier there, or whether we work with Saskatchewan and Manitoba to go to the Port of Churchill or somewhere in Hudson's Bay. We're very happy. We're collaboratively with all the provinces in partnerships. That's why we've talked a lot about economic corridors and pathways. And most importantly, working with our First Nations to make sure that they have a part to play and a role in this economic development that benefits them as well. So yeah, we are looking at every avenue and possible access to market. We just ask the federal government to help with that instead of standing in our way.
Government officials have often talked about red tape reduction and how it saves Alberta taxpayers a lot of money. Nathan, can you discuss how red tape has actually helped many Alberta business owners?
For sure. Red tape, every business owner knows the hoops they have to jump through to try to get their products sold and recover that cost and make a little bit of profit. When we can make that more efficient, we can make it take less time, they make more money, and we as Albertans all benefit. There's a couple of examples. We've changed some things under the Financial Innovation Act, which allows for a regulatory sandbox for some of these innovators to try things without having to answer every question, so we can determine more early what will work and what won't and refine that process. We've streamlined some regulatory requirements so that people can get their businesses operating more efficiently, not waiting for government for answers, but getting it in a more timely fashion. And an example there is we've changed things under the Municipal Government Act, which allows businesses to establish inter-municipal business licenses, people like food trucks, where they don't have to buy multiple licenses for municipalities are next to each other, saving them time, saving them money. And I think there's some estimates that it saved Albertans over $2.1 billion in the last couple of years. We're very proud of that fact.
Now, Nathan, you and I have chatted in the past about the physician shortage in a number of regions, including right here in Lethbridge. And now the province is investing $1 million to explore ways the post-secondaries, including the University of Lethbridge, can help deliver medical education. Can you explain that collaboration?
Absolutely. I'm very proud of the administration at the University of Lethbridge in their putting this idea forward, that there's lots of studies across Canada that show where people train is most often where they end up working, or in a similar kind of setting. Lethbridge is not quite rural, but we are definitely a smaller municipality. Having those doctors, those physicians being able to be trained right here in Lethbridge means that after their 7, 10, 12 years of training, they could be very established in this community and therefore more likely to continue practicing. It helps the students, it helps the university, it helps our region, and it helps our city. I'm very proud of this initiative that we worked at cooperatively with the University of Lethbridge, with the University of Grand Prairie, to make sure that we take the next step to help the future in terms of healthcare provision.
An author with a book about the beef on Wellington Street. That's next. Keep it right here. An Alberta author who has taken to writing books to express common concerns and solutions is Calgarian Derek Smith. Seeing all that was going on in Ottawa last winter with our politicians, honking horns, and hockey sticks, Derek decided to become an author of political commentary in the theme of a Seuss parody. Our producer, Michael Clausen, sat down earlier this week with Canada's court jester to discuss his two most recent works.
So can you give us the Cole's notes of what your book is all about?
As the pandemic rolled on and I seen what it did to people's mental health with lockdowns, with restrictions, after watching the live streams and seeing what it felt to be Canadian again, to see this group of people speaking out for frustrated Canadians as well as for an industry that desperately needed people to speak out for it, I knew I wanted to get into the satirical realm with books, and we kind of wanted to do something that was geared towards adult, but drawn towards the child aspect. And I started thinking about the Grinch, and I started thinking about all these different ways that we could fit in some of the jokes when it came to Justin Trudeau, because let's be honest, his gaffes kind of write the material itself. So at the end of the day, we took a lot of those jokes and put them into the book. We touched on the Freedom Convoy, we touched on the lockdowns, and it resonated with people and just took off. And it's been an astounding career moving forward. I've met some wonderful people. And we've really, I guess, touched some people where they needed to be entertained and have the need to laugh again because people had forgotten over those 2.5 years. And I think that was the most important aspect of this book, was to give people a chuckle.
Talking about the colorful background that you have, and your book is very colorful, why pick the style of satire and parody for this book that you have?
Well, if there's one thing I've noticed, that whenever opposition comes to be critical of our current government, it's often met with, we'll just say, a smothering boot, so to speak. People don't want to hear criticism when it comes to the current prime minister or his policies. And I've always been told that comedy is the best form of therapy. So when it came to a lot of the things that we put in the book, I mean, we've got the jokes on the blackface incident, the paper drink box, water bottle sort of things, a lot of his different policies, saying he's sick and hiding in his house. I really, again, when I started thinking about the Grinch book, it started to just make sense to me that there were a lot of comparisons that I could really put in line to make a funny story. And at that point, it just became relevant that let's see if there's a market for this. And it turns out there was, and we couldn't be happier.
Right. So do you feel a bit like a court jester?
A little bit. It's funny you mentioned that when the book launched and we were featured during its takeoff days by the National Post, And the day that article reached out, I was contacted by an agent who said he had a client who was interested in talking to me. Turns out that client was Preston Manning. And Preston Manning reached out to me as a fan. He had purchased the book, he'd read the book and enjoyed it. And that the court jester speech is actually what he included in his email to say, back in the old times, the court jester was the only one immune from mocking or satirically pointing fingers at the king. So he says, you've kind of turned into Canada's court jester. And that is, a title I'll happily accept at this point.
Well, and especially from Preston Manning, you're in good company with him. And it is true that, we can have comedy, we can have mainstream media and independent media and those things, but that role, whether it was 500 years ago in a king's courtroom, so to speak, or now, we still need the work of that court jester. So speaking of being surrounded by people, you were around people considered last year, especially to be the unacceptable fringe. What is the biggest misconception that maybe you still hear talked about regarding those who participated in the Freedom Rally in Ottawa?
Well, it's funny you ask, because during my time with this book, one of the people I've come into contact with and become very close friends with is, in fact, Tamara Leach. And she's introduced me to a plethora of people, from Keith Wilson, the Eva Chipiuk, the Freedom Convoy board themselves, several people within the workings of that. And what I find is that the news always reports one thing, and what you see in front of your eyes is another. Anytime I see any article that tries to villainize what happened or suppress what went on, I always look at it with a grain of salt and say, it's unfortunate. People can't meet these individuals head on and see what kind of people they actually are.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'm Jeanette Roche. On behalf of all of us here at Alberta Weekly, thanks so much for watching.